Hey, good morning. My name is Shawn. For those of you who don't know me, thanks so much for having me today. It's my pleasure to be with you. I want you to do me a favor really quickly, and I know for the introverts, you're going to hate it, but it's fine. What I want you to do is I want you to think about the worst gift you've ever received. Right? Like most of you, it probably comes to your mind really quickly. And what I want you to do is I want you to turn to the person next to you and tell them the worst gift you've ever received. Now, before you do that, if the person next to you is the person who gave you the worst gift you ever received, like just come up with something else really quickly or say, I don't know, I've never got a bad gift, whatever. But as long as it's not that person, turn to the person next to you and tell them the worst gift you ever received. All right, now we kind of prime the pump. I hope well, I mean, I feel bad because I don't want it to be traumatic or anything, but it probably brought back some like memories. You're kind of in that moment, and you know what it feels like when you get a gift, right? That like is just not what you really wanted. You know, they say the thought that counts, but sometimes you get a gift that is quite literally thoughtless, and so like, what do you do then, right? I'll tell you one of the worst gifts I ever got. I was a freshman in college. Now this was in the 1900s. It was 1998, but you know, that makes me feel old. So I kind of like to say it that way. But in the 1900s, I was a freshman in college. I was at what was then Florida Christian College, then became Johnson University, Florida. I was dating this girl. Well, I wasn't really dating. It was more like a situationship. We weren't really sure what was going on, but I was in the middle of kind of a difficult moment, right? And maybe it wouldn't be difficult for other people, but for whatever reason, it was for me. My dad had taken a new job, and he had sold the house I grew up in, like my mom and dad sold the house I grew up in, and they had moved like a couple states away, and I was the youngest, right? And so like my sisters were sort of scattered to the wind. And I was going through a moment, right? I felt a little bit lost, right? I felt like I really didn't have a home to go home to anymore, and I got a little bit depressed. I'm kind of prone to depression. I didn't know that at the time, but I was just down, right? And I'm talking to this young lady, and she can kind of tell that I'm going through a moment and stuff like that. And so she got me a gift, and I was like, oh my gosh. That is so incredibly thoughtful of you. Thank you so much. And I opened the gift, and it was one of the worst gifts I've ever received. I remember it distinctly. It was a book. Now, it's not a bad gift because it was a book. I like books. I'm totally able to read. And so, like, it was a book, and that wasn't what made it bad. It was a Dr. Seuss book, and that's not what made it bad either, right? I'm fine with Dr. Seuss, right? One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, right? I don't remember which Dr. Seuss book it was. But in it, she had written a note, really long note. And I started to read it, and I was like, oh man, that's so sweet. You know, she's going to be encouraging and stuff like that. And basically, the longer I read, I realized that the note said, your problems aren't that bad. Suck it up, buttercup. Stop being sad and be happy. Right? That was what she said, was quit whining and like get on with your life. And in that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Because while this gift is awful, it gave me the gift of clarity that you and I should not see each other because you do not know what sympathy is. I kept that book for a long time. I eventually got rid of it, but I kept it just as a reminder that sometimes people are horrible, right? It was a really bad gift. It was not what I needed. It was not what I wanted, and I would have preferred not to get it at all. I tell you that because I want to talk a little bit about gifts that sometimes we're given that maybe aren't the gifts we necessarily want. We're going to be preaching today out of the book of Daniel. It's a book of the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 3. It's a story that if you've been in church, you may have known, you may have heard before. But if you haven't, that's okay. I'm going to kind of fill in the details. But just to give you a little context about what's going on in the book of Daniel, is God had this people he'd selected, the people of Israel, right? And they had split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom had been swept away by a civilization called the Assyrians. And the southern kingdom was left, the kingdom of Judah. And then this power rose in the world, the Babylonians, and they conquered Judah. And when they conquered Judah, every culture sort of has its own way of dealing with people that it's conquered. The Babylonians wanted to take and they wanted to assimilate the Judeans into their own culture. They were going to take them out of the land they were in, out of Jerusalem, take them back to Babylon, right? And they wanted them to sort of assimilate into their culture. So their strategy for this was they took the best and brightest among the Jewish families, their children, right, of the important, prominent Jewish families, and they took them back to Babylon to be raised as Babylonians. They would educate them in the court of the king. They would teach them the ways of Babylon. And then these Judeans, when they brought the rest of Israel, right, into exile, when they brought the rest of them to live in Babylon, they could kind of be the translators to help these Judeans like understand and assimilate and kind of get on with the program of being a Babylonian. That was the idea. Right? And it's in the book of Daniel that we read some of the interactions of some of these young Judean men who were there in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar and what happened. Daniel is one of them, right? You might have heard of him and his lion's den. Today, I want to talk about three guys that you might have heard of as well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and an interaction they had with King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a powerful king, right? He turned Babylon into this worldwide dominant power, right? And so like he had just like this amazing amount of like cachet or power or clout with the people. And so one day his advisors wanted to sort of see him like increase that or like sort of solidify that. So they gave him some advice. They said, hey, why don't you do this, right? Make a giant statue of yourself, right? And whenever people will play some music throughout the city, and whenever people hear that music, they'll bow down and they'll worship you, right? It's kind of like a community building thing. It'll remind them like who the king and why all the good stuff in their life, who it comes from, right? It'll just sort of like be a good way for the city of Babylon, right, to like acknowledge, to accept you as king. And Nebuchadnezzar says, that sounds like a great idea. So he builds a giant statue. And so builds a statue, and they start playing music, and people start bowing down and worshiping this statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. But there are people there, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were raised as good young Jewish boys, right? Who learned the 10 Commandments that, like, you're not supposed to create idols, and you're not supposed to worship any god other than the God of Israel. And so, like, they see this statue of Nebuchadnezzar, and they see what's happening as worship to an idol. And so they say, nah. We can't do this, right? We're not going to bow down and worship this. And that's a pretty dangerous thing because Nebuchadnezzar was a pretty powerful guy and he had a pretty bad temper. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decided that they were going to stand on their principles and they weren't going to worship the idol. So here's what happens. Nebuchadnezzar hears about it. Some of the advisors tell him. Maybe some of the advisors don't really like these Jewish kids hanging out in the court, getting education and all that sort of stuff. They tell him what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do, and Nebuchadnezzar calls them before him. Starting in verse 13 in chapter 3, here's how it goes. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods and worship the image of gold that I have set up? He said, here's the deal. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I've made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you? He's like, maybe you didn't hear the degree, right? Maybe you didn't understand the assignment, right? And what you were supposed to do. So he gives them the benefit of the doubt. And he says, here's the deal. We're going to try this again. I'm going to play some music, right? There's the image. You're supposed to bow down and worship. And if you bow down and worship, like, we're cool. Everything's fine, right? Everything can go back to normal. But if you don't, right, I'm going to execute you. And like, come on, let's be real. There's no God that you serve that can save you from my hand. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "Oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. Now, if you've heard this story before, you kind of know where it goes from here. Nebuchadnezzar is furious at their response. And so he takes them and he heats the furnace up like 7 times what it normally is heated up, because he's just so angry. And he has men throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into this fiery furnace, tied up in ropes. And yet he looks into the midst of the fire, and not only does he see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not burning, right, freed from their bonds, but there's a fourth man in the fire walking around. He's like, man, that guy looks like the son of the gods. And so he calls the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he calls them out of the furnace, right? And he decides, okay, you don't have to worship the image of gold that I've set up. Not only that, right? No one is allowed to say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's a cool story, right? Probably the worst day of their life, or at least one of them, maybe second only to the day they were taken into exile into Babylon. They're brought before the king. Their lives are on the line. And yet from that comes this amazing moment where we see their courage, their faith, right? We're still talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because of what happened in that moment on what was one of the worst days, I assume, of their life. And the story's cool. Like I learned it as a kid, and it's kind of cool to picture like this fiery furnace and this fourth guy sort of showing up. But the older I've gotten, the more I focus, and the more it just kind of like, oh man, it just kind of grabs a hold of me. That statement by these 3 young men. We serve a God who can save us, they say. And with confidence and faith, they say, not only do we serve a God who can save us, we serve a God who will save us. But then they give this sort of like aside. But even if he doesn't, we're still going to worship God. Like, God can save us. We believe he will save us. But even if he doesn't, we're going to do what we believe is right. We're going to place our hopes. We're going to bet on God, and we'll take the consequences, whatever comes. Man, I think that's... I try, when I think about moments in history, I try and put myself in the shoes of the people who are there. What must it felt like in that moment to have your faith tested? And to stand in that moment and have to say, like, I will face the consequences, come what may. I know the God I serve. I know he'll save me. But right now, I know he might not. And I'm okay with that. I don't know if you know this, but... of all your senses, the sense of smell works different than any other sense that you have, right? When you see something, when you hear something, when you taste, touch, right? What happens in that moment is signals are sent to the thalamus in your brain. And it sends stuff on to the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is like the place that recognizes these senses, the amygdala, kind of emotional response. And it can kind of create a memory, right? So there's this path in your brain where you get the sense, it goes through this processing center, and then it goes on to these 2 other centers of your brain, and that's where it's kind of stored. But the sense of smell doesn't go through the thalamus. It has this other thing called the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory bulb has a direct access to both the hippocampus and the amygdala. So the memories that you form by scent are stronger and deeper than any other memories that you face by what you see or what you hear or anything else. And you probably know this, right? Like there's a certain smell of spray deodorant. It's Right Guard. I don't think they sell it anymore, right? But if I smell that smell, I'm immediately transported back to my 6th grade locker room, which is not a place that I particularly want to visit. And by the way, it's not a place that 45-year-old dudes should visit anyway. So like I try not to smell that smell. Like maybe you can't relate. Maybe you're like, oh, it's Axe body spray, right? Because when you smell Axe body spray, you just smell a whole like bus full of like teenage boys. Because let's be honest, if you're still wearing Axe body spray and you're older than 13, like, let's talk afterwards because we got some stuff to figure out, right? But like, there's that smell and it brings it back. There's a smell of perfume. When I smell it, I think of my wife. The smell of pine trees, right? Reminds me of Christmas. When you know this about the brain, you can kind of use that knowledge to to sort of hack the brain to sort of create memories that you want to create. I'll give you an example. I have here a candle, right, and a journal, right. For the past several years, I've taught as a professor at Johnson University, Florida, and that's the institution. If you don't know it, it started in 1975 as Central Florida Bible College, then became Florida Christian College, then became Johnson University, Florida. Its mission was to train young men and women to go out and serve the kingdom, right? My dad was in the first graduating class of this place. I went there. Both my sisters went there. They met their husbands there. My wife, she went there as well. That's where we met. Working as a professor at Johnson University, Florida, it was quite literally my dream. When I went to college in 1998, I did not apply to another college. There was only one college. I applied to Florida Christian College. It was pretty easy to get in, let's be honest. But I knew I was going to get accepted. But it was the only place I wanted to go. And when I got there, I met these professors, and they were amazing men and women of God. And they taught me how to read literature and how to understand art. And they taught me about philosophy and logic and scripture and everything else. And they poured into me, and they shaped me into who I was or who I am today. And I loved that experience. And at 19 or so, I kind of thought I was going to do this for a living. I was going to be a preacher. But at 19 or so, I was like, I want to do that. I think I might be gifted and shaped to do that. And I really wanted, above all else, to come back to that school and do for students what these professors had done to me. So being a professor at Johnson University, I structured my life. I pursued education. I pursued experience so that I would be ready and prepared, and that I would be a good fit to exist and teach in this place. So for the past several years, my dream has been a reality, and it's been pretty good. And so every morning, I'm excited when I get up to go to work. Or I was. Johnson University, Florida closed its doors this year. And so I'm no longer a professor at Johnson University, Florida, because it doesn't exist, right? But for a long time, I would wake up most every morning, right? Other than assessment day or something like that. But I would wake up every morning, and I was excited to go to work. I would get there early in the morning. I won't tell you what time because it just is kind of bragging. It was 4:30 in the morning, whatever. But I would get there really early, before everybody else, because there was just this. I could get all this work done and then be available for the students later in the day. But the first thing I would do when I got there in the morning is I would take out this journal. I have bookshelves full of these red journals, and I would take out a candle. Right? There are a couple different scents work. This is sugared lemon zest. It's White Barn candle. You can get them sometimes buy one, get one free when Bath and Body Works has a good sale. It's a pretty good scent. Anything that says sugar and citrus, I'm down with. Sandalwood, kind of gross. Again, Axe body spray. But I get out my journal and I get out my candle, and I light the candle, and then I do devotions. Right? I don't open my computer, don't do anything else. I read some scripture, I journal about it, and then I pray. And then when that's done, I blow out the candle, I close it, and I move on with my day. And over the time, that habit has made it so that when I smell this scent, right, it immediately transports me to this place, right? It's this special time, this sacred space between God and myself. And I read a book 15 years ago. I've read more than one, but this was one of them I read 15 years ago. And it said, as a preacher, most people don't really want to hear what you know. They just want to hear about, they want to hear an authentic, conversation between a person and their relationship with God. So if it's okay, I just want to tell you what God has been doing in my life for the past few years. I told you Johnson was the place I wanted to be more than any other, right? It fit with what I think God had gifted me to do, so it was a good place for me to steward my gifts. I got to pour into young men and women. I got to teach them about the world. I got to teach them about scripture, right? I got to teach them what it looked like to try and live and be a person of faith in the world in which we lived, and I loved it. I loved it. I think I was pretty good at it. Like my colleagues liked me, my supervisors liked me, even a couple students liked me. Like it was going really well, except for it's a tough time in higher education right now, and Johnson University wasn't doing so well. Enrollment had been dropping, the pandemic hit us, and we just never sort of recovered. And so like I'm not great at math, but I'm good enough to know, like for the past few years, I've known that like this day when Johnson closes its doors might come. Just not enough students, not enough funding. But every morning, I would get to the school and I'd walk into my office and I would open my journal and I'd light my candle and I would pray. And I'd pray for my family. I'd pray for other needs in the world. But almost every day, I would pray for the university where I worked. I'd pray for its students. I'd pray for its leaders. I'd pray that I was good at my job. But more than that, I would pray that God would like save this place. It's like, it's one of the places that's like the most special place to me in all the world. Like it is home. And man, gosh, I prayed. I filled so many journals praying that prayer. I burned so many candles, like asking God to give me this thing, like preserve this place. Like this place does good work. Almost every church like Canoe Creek that are part of this, like what we call Christian Churches, Church of Christ in the state of Florida, there is a man or a woman sitting in the pews or the seats or standing on stage who was a graduate or a student of this school. It's had this profound impact on the kingdom. We have graduates all over the world serving, and I'm like, God, of course this is a place you want to see continue, right? And like, this is who you made me to be. And then you gave me the gift. You gave me the thing I always wanted. Surely you won't take it away. I prayed that for a long time. And then God gave me an answer. And the answer was no. The answer was the doors are going to close. I guess something miraculous could happen, but we've already sold the property to the county, right? We've already cleared out most all the stuff. Today I'm going to clear out my office later today. And I guess God could still do something. And I believe he can. But I don't think he's going to. And so now, because I know what I know about the brain, when I smell this candle, I'm going to be reminded of like the worst gift that God could have ever given me. Or at least that's how it felt for a time. The thing that I feared, the thing that I wanted least of all, that's what I got. Now, I know that it's what I feared because I had this moment of clarity. I was driving down Nolte Road between St. Cloud confused me. It was like either Hickory Tree or Old Hickory Tree, and I was driving towards Canoe Creek or Old Canoe Creek or Canoe Creek Junior. I don't know which one, but I know I was on Nolte, and I was coming back because I had taught a class at Valencia. I still teach classes over there from time to time, and I was driving back, and this was a few years ago, and I had this moment of panic. This moment of anxiety, because I was good enough with numbers that I knew this day looked like it was coming, and I didn't know if it was going to be that year or the next year or the next one. But I had this moment of panic because, like, I knew that they have a campus in Tennessee. I knew that they might offer me a job in Tennessee, but I knew my family wasn't going to want to move there. And I had taught previously at Valencia, but I didn't really want to go back and be a professor there. And my wife's job was going really well, so I knew like I was going to have to stay in this place. And for the first time in my life, like I didn't know where I was going. Partly because I didn't know the road names, but I didn't know where I was going. Like I'd had this dream my whole life, and I was gone. What was I going to do? One of the cool things about getting your PhD is like when people are rude to you, you can say, oh, call me Dr. Grant, right? Like that's something you can do. It's like a card. It's not really worth all the education or everything else, but there was like some pride that I had in being a professor, some sort of cachet, like it was respectable. Like I was this person that, had done these things and people could look at me. I had degrees on the wall. I was good at it. That's who I was. That was my identity. And if it closed and it went away, like, who was I? Like, I guess, like, what do I do? What is my purpose? And over the past few years, God has been doing this thing, which I wasn't really prepared for, where he's sort of been stripping down my identity to give me a purpose that's beyond what I do, in my job, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. I started thinking about, God, what do you want me to do? Like if I don't have this career anymore, what's next? Where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? How do you want me to use my gifts? What does it look like to serve you when the place that I want to serve and the place that I'm good at serving is gone? And I felt like God gave me some clarity. He told me, right, kind of through his word. There's this guy that went up to Jesus one time and said, hey, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And I kind of felt like God said to me, and I'm not the type like this. Like God doesn't talk to me and tell me which kind of ice cream to buy or, like which way to turn or anything like that. Like I'm not like a mystic or anything like that. I'm not saying those people, like it's just like God and I have a different sort of relationship. But I felt like he was saying to me, like, your job is just to love me, right? To take your heart and your soul and your mind and just love me. Just be faithful. Right? Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter how much money you make. Doesn't matter your title. It doesn't even matter if you're all that successful in the eyes of the world. Like your identity, your purpose is to be faithful to me. And then I kept thinking and I was like, okay, be faithful. What else? And then I thought about the family that God has blessed me with. I have 2 wonderful children. I have 2 mediocre dogs. And I have a beautiful and wonderful wife. And I felt like God said, you should probably serve them. Like, you should love your wife the way that Christ loved the church. You should raise your children to know and love me in the same way that your parents raised you to know and love me. Like, it was kind of like, if I win at work, like if I win at the marketplace, if I get all the promotions and if I get all the bonuses and everybody thinks I'm great, and when I walk in the room, they're like, oh man, there's Dr. Grant. That guy's impressive. And I lose at home, I think I still lose. So I said, why don't you just do that? And I said, okay, I'll try that. And then the last one was, he was like, what if you just serve others? Like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. What if you just like tried to do that? Like, and just served others? And the reason I'm up here preaching this sermon is, one, because Ross had to go out of town unexpectedly and called me last night. It's also probably why it's not structured very well, but that's neither here nor there. Like, the thing I want for you today is not necessarily to know my story. That doesn't really matter. But it's, I want you to experience something that I've experienced. And I will tell you right now, the worst thing that I could have ever imagined happening to me, outside of like the death of a loved one or something, but the worst thing I could think of in terms of like career, it's happened, right? I lost my job. I lost my source of income. I lost my identity. I lost my purpose. I lost the place that I had invested my life over decades, right? I lost the thing that I had spent decades preparing to do all in an instance. And what God gave me instead was peace and hope and purpose. It doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter where I work. It doesn't matter how much money I make. It doesn't matter like whether I'm even all that good at it. All that matters is that I'm faithful to him and that I love my family and that I serve my neighbor. And if that's my identity, man, the whole world is open before me. It's not about this career or this place or that place. It's just about like being faithful wherever God takes me. And I am more at peace and I have more joy than I ever have in my life. And so when I open this candle and I light it, I guess I could be reminded of disappointment and heartache because this prayer I prayed, like, didn't get answered the way I wanted it to. But I don't think that's what I'll think. I think, first of all, and this is what I've been thinking for a while, when I smell this, I'll be grateful. Grateful for what God allowed me to be a part of, even if only for a time. And for a while, I thought that's all it was. It was just grateful that I had this thing in my past. Like, it was like, don't cry because it's over, smile because it's happened, like that sort of thing, like a Hallmark card version of it. Like, I'm just grateful that I got to be a part of it. Like, I made amazing friends. I got to invest in students. I got to use my gifts. Like, I loved it. But now I think it's something more. I don't think God closed Johnson University, Florida to, like, teach me a lesson. But in this, like in the worst gift I think I've received in the last several years, what he gave me was an identity and purpose and a freedom that gives me peace when I wake up every day, no matter what I do. So now I don't go to my office anymore. I go to Starbucks in the morning because they'll just let you hang out. I mean, they make you buy coffee, but whatevs. And so I go to Starbucks, and again, I'm not saying I'm better than you, but I get there at 5 a.m. Like I'm the first one in the door most days. And I take out my journal, and I don't light a candle because I don't think it's allowed. But I buy a coffee, and I pray. And my prayer this day is like, God, help me to serve others today. Help me to use my gifts today to make your love known. And this is what I want for you. If life isn't going your way right now, like if your career isn't going the way you want, if there's pain and suffering, like I don't wish any of that on you. But can I tell you what I hope for you? I hope that you allow God to redeem that suffering because he will. Like God will take the worst moments of your life and he will use them for your good and his glory if you will let him. If you're here this morning and you're racked by stress and anxiety, keep taking your medicine. I'm a big fan of the medicine, right? But I'm not saying to stop that. But I will tell you this. Your worth isn't tied up in your bank account. It's not tied up in your title. Your kids don't really care if other people at work are impressed by what you do. God loves you just the way you are. And no amount of work or effort will make him love you anymore. This morning, if you're winning at work and you're losing at home, man, I want you to check the scoreboard because you're losing. This morning, if everything is going great, I want you to know that God has placed you here to serve others. How can you serve your neighbor through what you do? How can you serve your colleague or your boss? Today when you go home, how can you serve your spouse or your parents or your brother or sister? I wouldn't wish it on anyone, and I wouldn't wish to go back and do it the same way if I had my choice. But oh man, I'm so grateful for what God has done in what seemed like the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And I know some of you are like the girl at the beginning of the sermon. You're like, your problems ain't that bad. Like, suck it up. Like, I get it. They're not, but they were bad for me. And in the process, I learned this thing. I believe more firmly now than I did before that the God I serve is able to do immeasurably more than what I ask or imagine, but even if he doesn't, I'm still going to bet on God. It's like Jesus knew what he was talking about. One time somebody asked him, or he was just talking, and he's like, hey, if you want to be my disciple, like take up your cross and follow me. For whoever wants to find his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? To have the peace and the joy and the hope that I had to have today, there was a version of me that had to die. And I'm so glad it did. Because today, I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be. Serving God, loving my family, and serving my neighbor. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your grace and your mercy. I thank you for your patience with us as you teach us again and again lessons we probably should have learned already, but you don't give up on us. Lord, I thank you for your love and your mercy, your love which knows no bounds, your mercy which is new each morning, the inexpressible and inexhaustible grace that you have for us. Thank you that you don't measure us based on our successes. Thank you that you love us even when things don't go our way. Lord, I pray this morning that all of us can place our hope firmly in you, that we can place ourselves on you as our foundation, that we can find our identity not in what others say we are, but in who you say we are. Mostly, Lord, I just pray that you help us to love you, to love our families, and to love and serve our neighbor. Thank you for all that you give to us and what you do for us. Pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you. I appreciate that. But the cool thing about this is it's not about me. It's about like what God is doing and who God is and what he's doing in this community. And every week we come to this moment in the service, and maybe it's become routine for you. Maybe you don't really understand what it is, but you call it communion, you can call it a rite, you can call it a sacrament, you can call it Lord's Supper. It doesn't really matter, right? It's these tiny elements that as a community we partake in. If you don't have them, they're on some tables in the back. You can go and grab them. But I just want to tell you what this moment is for me, because it's my favorite part of the service every week. What it is for us is Christ gave us this as a gift. He said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take some bread, and I want you to eat it, and I want you to remember my sacrifice on your behalf. He said, I want you to take some juice, and I want you to drink it. And he said, I want you to remember the forgiveness of sins that is purchased by his blood. And so every week here at Canoe Creek, we have an opportunity to partake in this thing that Jesus gave us. And here's what it is for me. It's a moment to remember who I am. No matter what else is going on, I'm a person who is loved by God, forgiven through the sacrifice of Jesus, and called to live for him. And every week is another opportunity to take the bread and to take the juice, to remember who I am, and to commit this day, this week, to live just a little bit more like him. Today, we're going to give you a little time to reflect and think. If you want to pray, if you want to sit there silently, or maybe it's just a time to think like, what would it look like this week if I were to love God just a little bit better, to love my neighbor just a little bit more, to invest in my family in the way that Christ loves us and loves the church. Partake of the elements when you're ready.